So the next talk excites me because I think it's going to be a real talk sesh. The talk is going to talk about the challenges of being an indie game dev. And we've got two experts coming right up to talk to you about strategies for navigating this space, having led their own game dev boot camps and run their own indie dev teams. So I'm going to shut up now and let y'all soak in that wisdom.
Hi, everyone. Hello, GDOC. Welcome to Indie Realities with Sherveen and Cheska. So I'm Cheska, she, they pronouns, head of curriculum at Coven. I'm also a game designer and the founder of Compact Games. And I'm here today with Sherveen, he, him,
Hi.
program instructor at Coven, and freelance game developer. And we are game creators with experience in many genres, studio structures, topics. This is a little bit of our convoluted backstory that we don't have time to get into, but you can follow us on the internet or take a class with us if you want to learn more about our deep lore. Thanks again for being here today and listening to our talk. So we believe that it's important to share knowledge and be as transparent as possible about our experiences within the games industry, in the hopes that it might inform others on their particular path. So today we're going to be sharing a look into indie development process, numbers, and more. So we're going to kick it off and we're going to start right away with the realities part of indie realities.
Yeah, so I'm just going to talk about some numbers. They're not like the most fun numbers to talk about, but I think it's worth getting into. About 3,821 premium games launched on Steam between January 1st and June 1st, 2020. It's kind of hard to find like very recent data like during the pandemic, but it's good to be on the lookout for it. But the kind of big takeaway here is that the top 2% of the games that launch on Steam are earning like 96% of the total projected revenue. So when you're thinking about like, how am I going to make my game make money, you have to understand that it's not a level playing field, and we really got to like be creative in how we're approaching this. So an average game on Steam sells about 2,000 copies and will make like about like 9.5K, 10K in revenue after being on sale for a year. And that's revenue, right? And that's over like an entire like kind of like lifetime of years. So if you're budgeting your game and you're thinking, okay, I really need this to sell, I really need this to make like 20,000, 50,000. That means that you have to be doing something to make sure that you are above the average game on Steam, right? So the last kind of statistic I wanted to throw at folks is that in 2022, so this is like the most recent data I have, I think if you have about 12.5 thousand or more wish lists on Steam, and for those who might not know, wish lists on Steam are like, you can tell Steam that you want to buy this game, and then when the game launches, it will notify you. And it's one of the like better things we have that correlate with your overall sales at launch. But yeah, if you have like about 12.5K, that means you are in the top 1,000 most wishlisted games on Steam. I have like a little data here, but the point is that's not the hugest number. And it takes it really, really creeps upward. If you look at this graph, it's kind of like has like a log trend line. And I've added like a little hockey stick here at the end where the wish lists really are probably jumping up right at the top 10 here. But for most folks, we're kind of like on this like left side of the trend line and kind of like really trying to creep up there.
Yeah, and to share some other numbers that developers have shared online. So in an interview for The Verge, Grace Bruxner, who is the developer of the Frog Detective series, shared that the first game in that series made around $7,000 in its first month. So priced at around $5, that's about 14,000 copies sold. And I remember at the time kind of being in, maybe a similar place in my career, both students at the time. I remember thinking this was a really low number at the time. It kind of surprised me because this was a game that I was seeing everyone in kind of development spaces talking about. And it also received a lot of industry recognition and awards. But again, looking at those numbers that Sherveen just shared, this far exceeds what most indie devs sell for their first commercial release. And also pulling some numbers from Finji, a developer and publisher. So Adam Saltzman, in a blog on gamedeveloper.com, had said that a spare few games will really hit that like 30,000 copies threshold. And if you're selling a game maybe at $20, you're breaking even, right, at that kind of 500K budget point. When you consider developer salaries, other costs, 500K goes really fast. And that's only to break even. So when we're thinking about how we're pricing our games, how we're scoping our games, how we're setting our development budgets, we need to take into consideration kind of, right, like how many copies we can actually expect to sell.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the high level indie reality that like we're kind of talking about here today in the talk. I think most developers, especially when you're an unestablished developer, if you're on a newer team, we're needing to rely on other revenue streams. We can't just assume that our games are going to be successful. So like contract work, financial support from family, spouses, friends, savings, like these are all things that I have personally made use of at times. So it's important to be really transparent that is going on. Otherwise, I think we're leading folks into dangerous situations financially. So just breaking even on development costs can be incredibly challenging.
Yeah, so to share a little bit of like personal numbers and experience from games that we've shipped in the past. So Starcrossed is an action arcade game that I shipped in early 2020. And this was a game that we worked on extremely part-time. We were a new team. We had no funding and no resources. And this was I think now looking back, would I have made the same kind of financial choices? Would I have made the same kind of team structure or like production choices? Absolutely not. In hindsight, we really didn't have a lot of decisions about how much time, energy, money it would take to actually make this game in the way that we wanted to make it. And then we also had no knowledge or experience making estimations, right, of how much of these resources we could actually expect to earn back as well. So looking a little bit at, how the team was structured, we were a main team of 4 working exclusively on revenue share, meaning that until the game launched, we weren't making any money. We weren't paying ourselves upfront for our labor. We were paying development expenses out of pocket, but any contract help, marketing expenses, we paid upfront. We were able to do that because we ran a Kickstarter, designated that time for crowdfunding. And we incorporated with a single owner, largely to reduce legal costs and annual incorporation fees, again, keeping our budget right out of pocket expenses as low as possible. But internally, we structured kind of decision making and how we ran our team closer to what you would see in a co-op style studio. We didn't track our time or pay ourselves for our time. And now I regret that so much because time tracking is data and that's how you make good estimations. But a really rough estimation valuing our time at minimum wage in the state that I was living at the time puts the salary cost of Starcrossed at almost 200K, which is, it seems like a lot, but that's a really reasonable budget for a commercial game. And 6 months post-launch, we had earned about 22K, already double that average, right, of that 10K most games make in their first year. We did above average, right? But obviously 22K is not 200K. This wasn't enough to break even on the time and resources we spent on the game, and wasn't enough to sustain our game to make future games, right? Sharing some numbers also of We Should Talk. This was a game where a goal of our team was to actually have upfront funding and scope our game accordingly. So we were only working on the game if we had budget to pay ourselves to do so. So we sought initial investment from a publisher, an incubator program, and a Kickstarter. And this was how we actually funded the development of that game.
Let's talk about mitigating risk. Sorry, everyone. My dog is
Percy!
getting in trouble. So, but we're doing this live. So, yeah, let's talk a bit about proving the hype, right? So I personally think there's no better time to start talking about your game early. I think one of the best ways you can prove excitement to not just like your audience, but also to funding partners is through things like social media, wish lists, crowdfunding campaigns. And it really helps you make decisions about your actual scope and roadmap. So like when I was thinking about crowdfunding, I pitched to like publishers and stuff really early. And I really like to get really quick no's from publishers so I can go, okay, I need to deal with this on my own. And then we sent like a bunch of surveys, and we were like, if I were to crowdfund this, based on like our playtest data, everything, like how much would folks spend on it? What would folks think? We like emailed people, we asked them the questions, and that's how I scoped pretty much everything in this process. So for Mid-Autumn specifically, marketing was super, super lean. We didn't have a website, we didn't have socials. We were just using our existing socials. We were relying on like events, press, and for better or worse, for this game, we really focused on wish lists. So like we don't have the biggest social media following, but our kind of wish list numbers are pretty high relative to that. So yeah, and I also have an image here just from like our initial Kickstarter launch tweet. And I just want to say that one of the reasons why most of my tweets aren't that high, but this one is because I like direct messaged as many people as I could. Like I messaged people who liked games that were like Hades. I messaged people who liked roguelites. I got into like a really awkward conversation with someone who just really liked Greek mythology and was like, why would you message me? But like that's what helped really get the tweet out there. And that's one of the things you have control over.
I'm laughing. The other thing, so yeah, once you've proven, right, that audience excitement, also that you have a team that's really excited about the game that you're making, securing funding becomes less of a hurdle, still really difficult. One of the best ways to provide, right, that stability for your team is ensuring that you actually have the funding needed to make your game before you actually make that leap into development, right? So there are lots of ways to find funding, but which one you should pursue is going to be determined by your own personal financial situation and also the needs of your project, the type of game, right, that you're making. But you'll also notice a lot of the ones that are listed here are really based on financial advantage, right? Like being able to even have savings that you can spend on a project, or family spouse support while you get your game rolling or your team more established, right? While you're building up that audience. And another thing to note is that some of these funding options like publishers and crowdfunding generally pitching to a publisher or pitching to a crowdfunding audience, you're expected to already have a game prototype to show that you can, do what you're setting out to do and you're able to make that game. Prototype funding is hard to find, but does exist. I would recommend checking out Glitch, Coven. We also offer some accelerators and programs specifically for prototypes, but also going after platform-specific funding. Oftentimes there are funds to get you started, get your project rolling, if you are targeting specific platforms. So definitely check those out as well.
And I think another big part of this is really learning how to estimate things, scope things accordingly. That's really, really difficult because where is all the information on how you actually do these estimates? So the way that I've personally done this is I just figure out how everyone else is doing it. I ask folks, I talk to peers. I'm like, how do you calculate how much you think your game's going to sell? And ask if folks have data that they can share. Most folks are really nice. You can't really share a lot of this stuff with other people, but people are usually like able to give you like either data or like high level information. I also like to assume that the market is probably going to be worse by the time you launch. So I account for that. If someone's giving you a number like, this many wish lists equals this many sales, that's a rule of thumb. I try to be a bit conservative with that. And there's a lot of really fun, free like resources. Like I put some links here from like Victoria Tran's blog about like community dev newsletter. And also there's one from like Rami Ismail. So there's lots of places to find like a lot of these tools. And I know that Cheska really loves this tweet about like the definition of an indie game developer is someone who says, this will definitely just take 3 to 6 months and then you spend 2 to 3 years on it, which is like weirdly like it's too real.
Yeah, make estimates and then double and triple your estimates.
Yes.
Yeah, and so in games when we're making these estimates, right, we often talk about burn rate. So what is burn rate? So burn rate is the monthly total expenses that your team needs to operate. So this might include salary, actually paying people. It might include software costs, anything else that you need to actually operate your team and make your game. So when we talk about runway is how much time you can actually sustain your team. So that's how much money, how much funding you have, divided by that burn rate, that monthly expenses, and that's how many months you have to make your game. So you should be scoping within that. And I also, your team might be in a situation where you're not running on money, right, as a primary resource. Maybe you're a student team or otherwise. So consider what other resources your team is spending. Time is a resource, motivation is a resource. So also think about those things as well. And when we think about, pitching to publishers or finding a funding partner to help us actually make our game, each one of these companies is going to be able to offer different resources. So I think you should be thinking about like what you're trying to make, what skills or maybe resources your team currently has, but what things your game actually is going to need to be successful, and look for a publisher or a funding partner that can provide that for you. So I think you could be looking for things, right, like funding, marketing support, or established audience in a certain genre, production support, possibly porting as well, if that's important for your game to get onto consoles. So definitely think about, all of these things, research the different agreements in terms of, investment recoup. That's, if a publisher does give you funding, how do they get that money back? When do they get that back? Also, in terms of revenue share, are you splitting revenue, with the publisher long term? What does that agreement look like? How is that going to affect your team, pre-launch, at launch, and after launch, post-launch? So be looking at all of these different things when you're researching and making, these potential agreements with other companies.
Yeah, I think another thing that when you're in the indie space that you have the ability to do is to really adopt like unconventional structures, especially in the remote era, post-pandemic. There's lots of like ways to get around things like office space costs or different things like that. And that's really going to help you to just think about that and be intentional about it. So for example, for Mid-Autumn, we all have day jobs on this project. We just roll on and off when we have availability, which means we don't officially have a burn rate. And it means we don't have the kind of stress you get with, we have to ship at a certain time or we're out of money. One of the reasons we're able to do this and work asynchronously is because I'm like the only person working in Engine right now. Whether or not that's a good idea, it helps us be able to maintain the structure we have. Other good things to think about are things like anthologies for labels. So this is when development teams or artists, they all release work as a collection or under some kind of shared label for shared visibility, and being able to market it together and being able to share resources. So Cheska did something similar with Cartomancy Anthology, but like other good examples are like Ice Water Games or the Haunted PS1 demo disc. Some folks do what's like ongoing crowdfunding, where you're creating content through development and you're constantly kind of funding ongoing work. I think like examples of this, Patreons, Coffee, Twitch. I think the Sock Pop Collective is a really good one to look at for something like that, and Eloise Game Dev. And now I think we can talk a bit about kind of definitions of success.
Yeah. And I think this is something that Sherveen and I talk about a lot, during our classes when we work with students, is figuring out like, what is the actual goal for yourself of the work that you're doing and the projects that you're actually committing time to. So I really like this quote from Tanya Short of Kitfox. If you really care about how some aspect of your game is received, for example, sales, reviews, tweets, or like audience reception, whatever, admit that to yourself. And then I recommend it becomes an explicit priority in how you create. So define success for your team. Figure out why you're working together. Why are you making this project? And every team is going to have very different motivations and things that they're trying to get out of their work. So for example, for Starcrossed, this was a time where our team was really early career. This was our first kind of large commercially shipped product, right? So all of our goals were really centered around, creating a high polished piece of work that we enjoyed working on. We could use as a portfolio piece for jobs and future opportunities. But the really big focus was gaining visibility and credibility as developers, so that when we went on to work on other projects, we had some kind of credibility already established, right? We had an audience. And another really important thing was just, the visibility of being involved in the game development community, participating, giving back, and knowledge sharing. And as a personal goal, I really wanted to release a game that was looked at as being, I guess, successful by industry peers, that had feminine aesthetics, non-binary and female heroes, and also queer content, because that's something that I think is really important that exists. So I'm really happy to say that we achieved all of these goals, but at the same time, you'll notice like none of these are, financial based goals. That wasn't a priority, and we had the privilege to make that kind of a secondary, kind of nice to have at the time.
Yeah, I think for Mid-Autumn personally, like we were making this at a different place in our careers than like Francesca was at when they were making Starcross. So one of the first things that was important to me was just making a project that all the collaborators that are on it are actually excited to work on. We started this during the pandemic, so everyone was super burnt out, super stressed, and that was like a big priority for me. But the kind of second really, really big thing was I didn't want there to be any unpaid work during development. I wanted to make sure that, unlike like other kind of projects I've been involved in the past, that everyone was getting compensated and was comfortable with the amount that they were getting compensated. I also really like the idea of games being like able to showcase people's like skills on the dev team so that we can use it as portfolio pieces going forward, and also just like help folks on their career journeys. And really, I'm mostly thinking about breaking. I don't think about the game in terms of profitability. Don't tell publishers that, but that's how I approach it, and making it scalable if needed. And then my personal goal was really just to make like a kind of commercial, non-art feeling game with Asian diaspora and gentrification in the elevator pitch. That's why I always mention it when I pitch it, because that's kind of like the whole point for me. And yeah, I think now we can talk a little bit about preparing for a successful launch. So this is going to be very specific to like my goals with Mid-Autumn, and I'm just going to talk through that a little bit with you in terms of where I'm at. So what I'm thinking about, we had a successful Kickstarter campaign. We raised about 40K with the campaign, and I think we ended up with like 36K, something like that, after like all the fees and everything were accounted for. And like I said, the project's been very wish list driven, so that's my main metric for are we going to do okay at launch. And just doing like some calculation, using like pretty much a lot of the estimates I found from newsletters, from things like that, I ended up with this number of like, based on how much money we're probably going to have spent by the time we launch, which is going to be like about $100,000, which is wild for my like little game with little pixel art characters. I probably want somewhere in the realm of like 23,000, 24,000 wish lists at launch. We're currently at a little around 10,000 wish lists at launch. And we get about 2,000 wish lists from like a good event. So Game Devs of Color, I would consider a good event. We get about 2,000 from here. And it's really just good to be in front of like audiences that get what we're making. So the main thing I'm thinking about is between now and our launch date, which we've announced, and it's in May, I have to do like 5 good events just to break even. Anything beyond that is kind of just like for me and for the team. So it's like, fulfilling development promises, making sure everyone in our audience is happy. When we do TikToks, when we do socials, when we do merch or anything like that, it's kind of just for fun, but also legitimacy. I think that I like to think of things as like a big ecosystem. So even if things don't lead to like a direct sale or money or things like that, I don't think that they're useless. So for example, we had like a really nice article from IGN that Rebecca Valentine did for us, like back when we were doing our announcement. And when I get like podcast invites or invites to do other festivals or things like that, or when I'm submitting things, lots of people come to me and are like, oh, I heard about you from that article or something like that. So that's definitely having like a lot of indirect effect, even if it's not like always going to be the most tangible thing. So yeah, that's basically what I'm thinking about right now. And we can move into kind of like our key takeaways.
The indie game market is challenging. I think that's what we want to communicate, is that you do need to be thinking about risk and you do need to be planning. But also, this is not to scare you or discourage you. This is just so that we can go in, being knowledgeable, seeking support, and also mitigating risk. And we can do this by, being intentional with our time and our resources, having clear definitions of success as individuals, but also within our teams. assuming we will need a reliable stream of income and funding, and making sure that we have that so we're not putting ourselves in a place of risk, and also scoping and budgeting accordingly as well. So we hope that this was helpful and insightful, shows you a little bit behind the curtains of our own development process and the things that we're thinking about and experiencing. But we went through that very fast. Please do follow up with us, reach out. We would love to support you and also talk about your particular interests and projects. So thank you.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you to our lovely speakers for dropping those knowledge bombs and helpful pro tips. If y'all learned something that you think would help an indie game dev out there, definitely encourage you to share it and drop our hashtag. The more, the merrier.